Morning all. In celebration of the upcoming World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand, very soon now, just next month, let's have a look at another fascinating past encounter, this time from the Linares tournament of 2007. Just as a quick side note about Linares, the Linares International Tournament was an annual chess event played around the end of February. It took the name from the city of Linares, where it's held, and it's sometimes described as the Wimbledon of chess. So Wimbledon is very famous in tennis as being a very exciting lawn event, and it's something I follow each year. But Linares was equivalent of Wimbledon, so a very, very special event. In fact, one of the greatest players in the history of chess, Garry Kasparov, had won Linares 8 times. Ivanchuk 3 times, for those interested, and Anand 3 times. Carlsen only had 3 tries to try and win Linares before it stopped in 2010, the last Linares. He came close, but he didn't quite win it. But in this Linares 2007, let's see what happened. So Magnus Carlsen was white against Vishy Anand. So d4 from Magnus. Vishy responded with d5. After c4, we see c6, so the Slav defense, which is a kind of a modification on the more classical Queen's Gambit decline. The bishop is not blocked in, so it's kind of paying a lot of respect to the past masters in occupying the centre very solidly, unlike the hypermodern systems like the King's Engine or Groomfield. They're very, very solid grip on the centre without any issue of the bishop. So it's kind of an upgrade in a way on the Queen's Gambit declined. So knight c3, knight f6, and now Magnus chooses the kind of looks a little bit timid e3, but it means that the bishop is now able to capture immediately on c4. There's no speculative gambit at all, which might occur sometimes here. And now Vishy responds with e6, and then we see knight f3. And for those just interested in a little bit of theoretical understanding of this, it seems Black shouldn't be committing the bishop here to e7 or d6 just yet. The most popular move by far is knight bd7, which is played. And now actually moving this bishop, which does sort of encourage a tempo gainer with d takes c4, is not the most popular move. Actually, the most popular seems to be queen c2. But Magnus chooses bishop d3. And now Black again is not moving this bishop. He wants to sort out this bishop, make preparations for it, usually on b7. And he can do this now with d takes c4. So after bishop takes c4, b5 vacates the b7 square for that bishop to try and be wonderful on the diagonal in theory, or much better than at the moment. So the bishop drops back now to d3. And now often it is played a6 or bishop b7, but this is another popular idea, just bishop d6 now, not bothering to immediately occupy b7. Okay, and Magnus now castles, Vishy now castles. Okay, and here is where the most popular move in this position is actually queen c2, exerting some pressure on h7, and also facilitates potentially knight e4. An example of queen c2, for example, queen c2, bishop b7. Actually here, a3 is the most popular, a6, b4, trying to lock down this bishop. This is an example continuation. But in the game we see actually a rare move, and we're going to depart now from theory quite a bit now with b3. Okay, so b3, it's got some perks to it. If b4, maybe white can play knight a4 and just try and clamp down on that c5 square. There is potentially a backward pawn on the semi-open file here. So b3's got some good things going for it. We see Vishy playing bishop b7 and bishop b2. a6, and now Magnus plays knight e4, and let's put on a Kabitsa here, around about here. This position, from an engine point of view, is actually just about equal. It's interesting, both bishops are kind of pointing at each other's kings. They look, it's kind of a symmetry about the bishops here. We see knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight f6. Bishop now drops back to c2. Maybe this is a slight tiny mistake, actually. Tiny mistake, at least from an engine point of view. Bishop d3 might be a little bit more flexible on there. You know, maybe queen e2 and a4, for example, as a plan. So bishop c2 might be a tiny little inaccuracy. It seems as though black is doing better than he should be, more equal than he should be. So c5, it looks as though black's got no real problems. Both bishops have nice scope here. And in fact, this f3 and h2, this crudity of knocking out the knight on f3 does give some concern for h2, at least psychologically, to a lot of players. So we see d takes c5, bishop takes c5, the bishop's now biting on e3, okay. And it looks as though, again, this symmetrical kind of bishop's working on black's king as well. Then if f6 can be knocked out, is an h7 an issue. And actually this is really tested here, fascinatingly. So we see actually Magnus playing knight g5, and it looks as though, you know, if you're a beginner, you might play this just to try and win a pawn. It looks like a simple threat move, but Magnus Carlsen is an experienced GM now. In 2007, he was a GM from the age of 13 from 2004. So when he plays this move, it's with much deeper reasons than just trying to win a pawn. But it does invite an exchange of queens. So we see queen takes d1, rook a takes d1. So what is white's principal threat? Well, simply it is just to take on f6 and then take on h7, perhaps with the knight. In fact, just taking on the knight, otherwise lots of pieces will be en prise. So how does black actually parry this threat? I think Vishy played one of the best moves to parry it. There's two major options here, king h8 or h6. On h6, white actually might be doing very, very well here after bishop takes f6, because if hg, we're just winning a pawn, clearly. And if g takes, then actually knight h7 apparently, or knight e4, gives white something. It's double attacking on f6 and f8, and white can safely do this in this position, and for example bishop e4 to avoid any discoveries on the bishop here, and usefully the knight is actually quite useful on f6 here. So this is actually promising white a small advantage. But actually we see in this position, okay, we have this simple idea of taking and playing to win this pawn, but we see a remarkably powerful move in king h8. The engines actually love this move of Vishy Anand. So why? Well, let's see what would happen if bishop takes f6. Now this wasn't played. If bishop takes f6, g takes. Now you might be asking, well, what about knight takes h7? Now in this position there's a crucial difference with the king on h8. It's this g file. g2 is under great scrutiny here, and in fact rook g8 now causing white some issues. Here in fact, if white has to respond to this threat, say with g3, this isn't looking too good, because now can you see what black can do, which would leave white in serious trouble? If I gave you 10 seconds here in this side variation, you might want to pause the video. Well, black actually has some good options, actually, maybe more than a couple, but king g7 perhaps is the strongest, and that knight's kind of stranded. So okay, there isn't after king h8, it's kind of asking white, what is he doing? Can actually white retract this operation if it's not that effective? Or can he just take on f6? Maybe taking on f6 might actually be a good idea after g takes. either here knight e4 or just rook d7 looks quite dangerous. So say like this, knight takes f7, rook c7, and white's actually doing quite well. So actually this looks to be a good continuation for white to play actually bishop takes f6 here. In fact, if black can't improve, that looks pretty bad, but actually black can improve here with f takes g. And opposite coloured bishops here, this should be about equal. It's a minuscule advantage, if it is any advantage for white, no, but with opposite coloured bishops this looks extremely drawish here. But in the game we see actually a remarkable move by Magnus, which commits to long-term weaknesses g3. So it might not be the absolute best move here, because now something very, very interesting as well. Okay, it shields against this potential g-file stuff, so kind of prophylaxis. But prophylaxis in weakening the light squares, is there any other downside apart from these light squares? In fact there is, and this is showing up now, because Vishy now plays h6, and it's got slightly more effectiveness in a key variation here. White now plays bishop takes f6, and actually although the idea of rook g8 doesn't work here, that's been made less effective because there's no immediate threat on g2, so this doesn't work at all like before. You know, rook g8 doesn't do anything, so we could just pick up f6, so white will be doing well here. But actually there's a slight nuance here, very, very important, that actually Vishy can play now h takes g5, believe it or not, and the g5 pawn is immune. If bishop takes g5 was played, which it wasn't, black now has f6, just winning the whole bishop. You know, if the bishop moves to f4, then e5, trapping the bishop. So a big difference. After this threat, the bishop's just still trapped. So that's not very good at all. So this changes the picture significantly in this position. And so Magnus can't play bishop takes g5, he retreats the bishop to b2. And black hasn't just equalised out, black is actually threatening to be ever so slightly better. Even though he's got the double pawns, you might think, well, double pawns, is that a problem? But it's a pawn close to the centre, and this is significant, these light square weaknesses. Black is looking very comfortable here. You can almost say, okay, the two bishops on either side, blacks are slightly more comfortable. After rook ac8, there is a concrete threat now, bishop takes e3, just to snap up a pawn. So we see actually rook c1, rook fd8, and it looks as though there's a concrete threat again, just to come to d2. Magnus plays rook fd1. But this now shows these light square weaknesses are quite painful, because now bishop f3, forcing control of that d file for a moment. So we see rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and there's no useful discovery on the bishop on c5 here. So Magnus plays a3, and it looks as though, well, the pawns on this side are going to be looking exactly the same after b4. But black stops that b4 move. Vishy plays b4, so he's got more than his fair share of space, it seems, and that possession of the d file. But is this actually lost for white? No, it's only slightly better for black here. It's just easier to play. Magnus now plays a4. I think it will be much worse to play a takes b here. After bishop takes b4, for example, black can carry on with g4, and it just looks like a very, very nice position. I think it will be very difficult for white to play this. For example, like this. It looks as though black has all the positional trump cards here. So okay, Magnus, plays a4, a lesser evil move, and now we see f5, which is a very, very aggressive move, blunting the bishop, but also potentially threatening f4 to try and expose f2 as a weakness for rook d2 to be very effective, coordinating the bishop and the rook on f2. So it looks as though, is this position really starting to creak? And also there's no discovery on c5 here. This bishop is forming a mating net with the rook. You know, bishop takes f5. This clearly doesn't work because of rook d1 mate. So white's kind of tied down here, a very unpleasant position. So it's the sort of position which very limited play from white. And so what can Magnus do? He plays king f1. So if the king is trying to be a little bit safer for various threats here, but we see now Vishy trying now f4, which might not objectively be the best move. Black actually didn't need to do f4. If, for example, king g8, what could happen? King e1. And the idea now would be bishop d1 to try and wriggle, start wriggling, and also attack this bishop. So if the bishop gets out of the way, bishop d1, bishop d5, and white is just fractionally worse. It's probably quite holdable. So basically f4 is a little bit of a gambling move, because it is giving access to g6 from the bishop. And actually white misses an opportunity now to make use of this. White could actually have taken this pawn, either the g pawn or the e pawn. So there's at move 27 an uncharacteristic mistake perhaps. So e takes f4, for example. If rook d2, bishop g6, actually it looks pretty dangerous that there's apparent coordination between the two bishops and the rook. But after rook takes f2, for example, what does black actually do here? If he moves the bishop back, he's actually getting mated to rook c8 here, because the bishop's coordinating with the rook there for a mating net. So black is actually forced into just having a perpetual check. White doesn't want to go into any double discovered checks. That would be the end of the game, of course. But if he stays out of danger, out of these dangerous checks, white's actually okay here. White's got this rook c8 resource. So this was the way to just achieve a draw, just taking the pawn and playing bishop g6. So if we go back, so it looks as though after f4, in fact it can also be taken the other way. It's the same situation, inviting the rook for dinner, but bishop g6 saves white here as well. There's no nuance here. But Magnus unfortunately played a big mistake now, it seems, in retrospect. Bishop e4. Now it looks on the surface opposite coloured bishops should draw as well, and there's no invasion of the rook on the 7th rank here, so in a way it looks like an improvement from a human point of view in some respects, not allowing the rook on the 7th with such visual coordination. So we see actually, okay, both bishops attacked. Vishy now plays bishop takes e4, and after rook takes c5, also g5 is attacked here. So it doesn't look as though, for example, rook d2 would be sufficient here. If rook d2, in fact, this should be actually okay for black anyway. After bishop d4, f3 is dangerous. But Vishy actually plays rook d1, which is also a very, very strong move. After king e2, now rook b1. So white's not really being given a chance for g5 or coordination yet on g7. This bishop's being attacked. It moves. And now we see a very, very powerful move, gaining more space and uncomfortableness for white now after f3 check. So b3 is also hanging here after king d1. Now this is taken. Rook takes b3. It's unpleasant. If white tries rook takes g5, let's have a look at this. Magnus chose in the game rook c4, but if rook takes g5, this is very dangerous. After rook b1, there's a very, very dangerous pin here, and it looks as though black's just threatening b3 and b2. And actually the pawn on a6 is quite useful as well for stopping rook b5, coincidentally. So this is actually much better for black. It's approaching a completely lost position. So let's go back. So we see actually rook c4 being tried. So accepting now for the first time being a clear pawn down. And now Vishy plays bishop d3, and we see check, king h7. And now e4, trying to extend the scope of the bishop, get it out, but the bishop is now pinned. So it's a very miserable position indeed, and in fact this pawn is now dropping off as well. If the pawn moves, then again b3 is very powerful here. Don't think this is sufficient. Rook b8. What can black do here? Just bishop e4, and it looks as though white's almost getting into a kind of zugzwang type position. So for example, h3, bishop d5, a5, rook a1, and white's in a kind of zugzwang here. His king can't move. If king d2, for example, then check, and this is getting very nasty, losing another pawn. So that would be a totally miserable position. Zugzwang, opposite coloured bishops. It's just collapsing for white there. So, okay, so basically now Magnus is getting even a worse position, losing another pawn after king d2, bishop takes e4, 2 pawns down now. We see king e3, bishop d5, bishop d2, check, king d4, now rook b2, bishop e3 at least holding the f2 pawn, rook e2, and this pawn is a real menace. Now this is the clear pass pawn, rook c1, and an even more accurate move than b3 though is played here. Can you spot what Vishy Anand plays in this position? b3, there might be a faint hope of a blockade. So black to play here, what would you play as black? If I gave you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, Vishy actually played the cruel bishop a2, which makes b3 and b2 even more effective than the rook b1 resource. If he had played b3, I mean, it looks pretty miserable for white in any case here. King c3, for example. In fact, b2 is still pretty diabolical. This position here, black is actually winning tactically in any case with rook takes e3 and then f2, and this is actually winning for black because if rook takes b2, well, f1 queens, and if king takes b2, black would have bishop c4, just winning the rook. So in the game, anyway, after bishop a2, Magnus resigned. So it was an absolutely miserable game in the Slav defence where Vishy Anand equalised, and that very, very cunning king h8 created a new bag of tricks actually after g3, which exposed g3 for potentially trapping white's own bishop tactically. Black gambled though later with f4. He was actually objectively, Vishy Anand was objectively just drawing this after f4 because it does mean bishop g6 is an available resource to create a mating net for the king potentially with rook c8. So this was a terrible mistake actually in retrospect to play bishop e4 here rather than just taking and inviting the rook to the 7th rank, which looks counterintuitive, but white has sufficient resources here, just taking on f4 and then bishop g6. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.